This week we're going over Chapter 16 in our ecology chapters, as well as a few selections regarding a plant section for Chapter 17 through 19. Chapter 16, you're expected to know the material for sections 1, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. You'll need to be able to explain what biodiversity is and why it's important. Explain how extinction reduces that biodiversity, especially emphasizing how human activities can have disruptive environmental impacts, and briefly discuss strategies we can develop for effective conservation. Biodiversity can have extrinsic or intrinsic value. This is an example of an extrinsic value, meaning value that comes to us humans because it directly benefits us. As you probably know, there are plants that have properties we've utilized for food and for medicines as well. The Pacific yew tree shown here, the bark of it was found to contain a chemical called Taxol that is an effective treatment in several different types of cancer and is one of the oldest cancer medications that we have, and we still do use it today. And it is currently a $1 billion a year industry in pharmaceutical sales. Of course, there's an intrinsic value as well, and by intrinsic I mean there's an inherent value of biodiversity independent of its value to humans. So it's not always just about us. The loss of Earth's biodiversity can be hugely detrimental to many, many species. The definition of biodiversity is here. It's the variety of genes, species, and ecosystems on Earth. And again, it has intrinsic value as well as extrinsic value, the extrinsic value being value to humans. Another definition to know is maintaining biodiversity falls under the realm of conservation biology, which is an interdisciplinary field that addresses how to preserve the natural resources of the Earth. Biodiversity is, of course, everywhere on the planet, but there are some hotspots that contain more biodiversity, meaning a greater variety of gene species and ecosystems than others. And there's not very many of them. There's only 25 biodiversity hotspots around the globe, and it covers less than 1% of the world's area. And even though it's only less than 1% of the world's area, those hotspots have 20% or more of the world's species living in them. Habitats included among the biodiversity hotspots are tropical rainforests, coral reefs, islands, and deep oceans. And another thing to point out is that these biodiversity hotspot regions of the world are significant reservoirs of biodiversity that are under threat of destruction. So I want you to know here globally where they're mostly located. You're not seeing a lot north or south, so the most of the hotspots are going to be located here near the equator. So go ahead and answer this question. It's sort of testing your ability to look at the graphs and assimilate this information. Pause the video if you need to. The answer is, of course, 0. So both in the context of terrestrial, shown here in the green bar graph, as well as aquatic or marine, shown here in the blue bar graph, you're going to have the most biodiversity towards 0 latitude, aka the equator. And you also have quite a bit of biodiversity if you move 20 degrees north or 20 degrees south. But see, as you move further and further away from the equator, like 40 or even 60 degrees, you're going to see a sharp decrease in the number of species. So biodiversity is not evenly distributed over the Earth, and for nearly all groups of plants, animals, both marine and terrestrial, meaning living on land, biodiversity is greatest near the equator and progressively falls off towards the north and south poles. You can probably figure this out about the equator, that factors that influence the species richness in an area include the amount of solar or sun energy available, and the rate of environmental disturbance is going to be important too. because these hotspots are regions of significant biodiversity that are under threat of destruction. This is an example of extinction caused by humans that limits biodiversity. This is the Bengal tiger. It has been hunted, captured, and poisoned to near extinction. We've talked about this before. There are, of course, different types of extinction. There are two we talked about, background and mass. And there are multiple causes of extinction. So this first example I want to talk about is a passenger pigeon. So imagine that you are on a deserted island, alone. It would be hard and it would be lonely. But the hope of rescue someday would probably make things bearable. Martha, a passenger pigeon living in the Cincinnati Zoo in the early 1900s, found herself in a situation of that sort, minus the hope. That's because passenger pigeons in the wild have been completely wiped out by a combination of factors, including hunting of the birds for meat, loss of their habitat due to deforestation in North America, and disease. And so except for the small flock that Martha was part of, the species was gone. One by one, the birds of her flock died as well, and when the second to last passenger pigeon died in 1912, Martha was all alone. She lived for 2 more years with no possibility of ever reproducing, and then she died on September 1, 1914. So humans saw this species become extinct right before our eyes because of our own interference. One example of factors that influence the risk of extinction in the case of background extinction, the example we just talked about was more toward a mass, but in the case of background extinction would be habitat tolerance. You, as a species, can have either a broad or a narrow habitat tolerance. On the left is your example for a broad. These birds can live on land, they can live in the trees, they can live in bushes. Versus on the right, the species has a narrow habitat tolerance, meaning you can only live in a very particular place on a very particular tree. And I think it's common sense that species with narrow habitat tolerances are at greater risk of extinction than species with broader habitat tolerances. Habitat tolerance describes the breadth of habitats in which a species can survive. Some plant species, for example, can tolerate large swings in water availability or soil pH or temperature. Others are limited to a very narrow habitat range. In the case of the now extinct passenger pigeon, they can only build nests in a specific type of forest and needed large numbers of individuals, breeding communally in order to breed successfully. As forests were cut down, that was the fault of humans, and as the birds were hunted because of humans, the size of their flocks diminished. So the combination of our interference and their narrow habitat tolerance made the passenger pigeon extremely vulnerable to extinction. In general, because species with narrow habitat tolerance cannot adapt in the face of habitat degradation and loss, they're at greater risk than species with broader habitat tolerance. Another example would be pandas. So pandas have a very strict diet, very narrow diet, and if humans continue to deplete the bamboo resources, pandas would eventually go extinct because they have not learned to adapt to eat a variety of foods. Alright, so go ahead and pause this to answer the question. The answer is number 4. We just talked about how they had a narrow habitat tolerance. Extinctions occur for different reasons. Mass extinction versus background extinction. So for mass extinction, can destroy many or all of the species in an area, and it reflects some bad luck, if you will, more than the particulars of a species' biology. So it's caused by environmental forces more than intrinsic adaptation of that species. In comparison, background extinctions tend to be consequences of one or more features of the species' biology itself. And then factors that contribute to extinctions of either type would include small population size, limited habitat tolerance range, and narrow habitat tolerance contribute to those background extinctions, especially. Sometimes you can be so close to something it's difficult to really see it, which may be the situation humans are in right now when it comes to the global loss of biodiversity. Humans are becoming increasingly aware that we are in the midst of a mass extinction. In a recent survey by the American Museum of Natural History, 70% of biologists indicated that they believe that this is true and that steps must be taken by governments and individuals to stop this massive loss of species if we are to avert a global crisis. More serious than the threats posed by depletion of the ozone layer, global warming, and pollution. Data on current rates of extinction in every well-studied group of plants and animals support the hypothesis that a mass extinction is indeed underway. Here's some data for you. So among the mammals, 11% of all species are currently endangered. So the definition of endangered means that they're under imminent threat of extinction. Also among mammals, 14% are threatened. Threatened is defined as vulnerable to extinction. So of all mammals, 25%, a quarter of them, are endangered or threatened, so near extinction. In the case of birds, 4% of all species are endangered, but 50% are in decline. Almost a third of all amphibian species are threatened, and among fish, insects, fungi, plants, the story is the same. So what do those numbers mean? Let's look at it in the context of background extinction to see how drastic these mass extinction numbers are. Historically, background extinction rates are about 1 extinction per million species per year. But the numbers I just quoted you suggest that current extinction rates are 1,000 times or more greater than that usual background extinction rate of 1 extinction per million species per year. So 1,000-fold greater in the number of extinctions. So unlike the mass extinction event in which the dinosaurs and most other species were wiped out in the wake of an asteroid hitting Earth, the cause of this current mass extinction seems to be the result of the activity of one species, humans. Ironically, it is the unprecedented success of humans that is responsible for this situation. The resource needs of so many people have inevitably interfered with the ability of other species to coexist with us. So mass extinctions up to now, all of them have been caused by environmental factors, asteroids, ice ages, but here, this is the first one that a species is making it happen, and the case of the species is humans. The chief reason for the loss and impending loss of so many species is due to habitat loss and habitat degradation. Particularly harmful to that is habitat loss in Earth's tropical rainforests, because remember, those are hotspots where biodiversity is greatest. In the past 25 years, just 25 years, half of the world's tropical rainforests have been destroyed. Obviously, that's not sustainable. So half of the world's tropical rainforest in 25 years, usually by burning to make way for agricultural use of the land or by logging to get timber. Urban development, too, is responsible for destruction of rainforests as the growing human population continues to expand. Beyond habitat loss, though, other factors reduce biodiversity, including overexploitation of species, including those killed for food, furs, and medicinal products. Here's an example of bonobos. Bonobo is actually a type of chimpanzee. You've probably never heard of it. It's an ape. It's a type of chimpanzee, and it's arguably our closest living relative. Chimpanzees are always cited as our closest living relative, but more specifically, it's actually bonobos. People just don't talk about them because no one knows what they are, and they're very rare. You've probably never seen them in a zoo. I've never seen them in a zoo. Bonobos, our closest living relative, are no longer seen in the wild because they have been driven to extinction, hunted for food. And as we'll see later in the chapter, the introduction of exotic species too is having significantly adverse effects on biodiversity. So consequences of the loss of biodiversity beyond the values of biodiversity discussed earlier are largely unknown, but most likely include a serious reduction in the capacity of the environment to recover from environmental and human-induced disasters. Okay, how did human activity lead to the extinction of the passenger pigeon? We already said that passenger pigeons had a narrow habitat range, but now I'm asking about the human activities. So go ahead and pause the video. The answer is number 4. We destroyed their habitat, which they were had a narrow tolerance for a certain habitat anyway, so that wasn't good, and overexploitation in the context of hunting. So the majority of biologists believe we are currently in the midst of a mass extinction due to human activities, which could have serious threats not only on biodiversity as a whole intrinsically, but even threaten humans. So now we'll talk about how human activities reduce biodiversity by damaging the environment. So here, this is a picture of Hong Kong, and there's this vast green jungle that surrounds Hong Kong and right up against these huge skyscrapers. The first way we'll talk about how human activities can damage the environment is through the introduction of non-native species that may wipe out native organisms. 2 characteristics in particular make invasive species harmful. One is exotic species have no predators in their new habitat, so their populations grow unchecked. Number 2, native plants and animals have no mechanism to compete with or defend themselves against invading exotic species. So an example of an exotic species that you'll be familiar with would be boa constrictors in Florida. So people get them as pets and then they release them or they escape. Then all of a sudden you have this exotic species running around that has no natural predators because it was not adapted to living in Florida until we artificially brought them there. And there are no defense mechanisms in the plants and animals to deal with boa constrictors, so they die at an alarming rate. We don't have to look beyond the borders of the continental United States to find examples of exotic species that are responsible for massive ecological shifts and economic costs. Purple loosestrife is an attractive flowering plant that is native to Eurasia. It was imported to the United States in the 1800s as a garden plant, but it rapidly escaped from cultivation and invaded wetlands in every state except Florida. It produces thousands of seeds a year and also spreads by sending out underground stems. This aggressive growth overwhelms native grasses and flowering plants, replacing diverse wetland communities with monocultures of loosestrife that provide poor quality habitat for bog-dwelling insects, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. The title of most destructive invader, though, in North America may belong to the zebra mussels. These thumbnail-sized freshwater mussels are native to Eastern Europe and Western Asia. In the early 1800s, the mussels spread to Western Europe, and they came to North America in the 1950s after completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway allowed ocean-going ships to enter the Great Lakes. Female mussels produce up to 5 million eggs per year, and the larvae settle on any solid surface, even clogging the intake pipes of water treatment plants and factories and the cooling systems of power plants. In addition to damaging the industrial facilities, it depletes resources that are available. Like, it's using so much resources that there's fish and that don't have enough food for themselves. So that was unintentional introduction of an exotic species. Here we have an example of intentional introduction. So intentional introduction happens all the time, and this is, I think, the funniest example of it going awry. One legendary pest is the cane toad. It was imported into Australia to control an agricultural pest. So there was a bug running rampant, eating up food, and they thought, oh, we'll bring in these cane toads so they can eat this agricultural pest. But the cane toad population exploded and spread throughout much of the continent. They now number more than 200 million and have become a nuisance in much of the country as conservation workers struggle to determine how to control their numbers. The cane toad illustrates a common feature of most exotic species introductions. Even when intended as a method of biological control of pests, their effects on the ecosystem are unpredictable and often terrible. So how can invasive species outcompete native species? Go ahead, pause, and answer the question. The answer is 5, so it's number 3 and 4. So number 4 is correct because there are no natural predators for that exotic invasive species because it's not adapted to that environment. Number 3 is also correct. There's no natural pathogens. Number 2 is not necessarily correct, and number 1 is not correct because they are probably better adapted to the environment they already lived in. Okay, so exotic or introduced species can be intentionally or accidentally introduced into a new habitat, and they then become considered invasive species if they cause harm in their new habitat. The reason that exotic species often come to be considered invasive because they have no natural predators to reduce their population size, and they often encounter prey with little or no defenses against them, and they can dominate and alter communities and entire ecosystems. The next human activity is causing acid rain, which harms forests and aquatic ecosystems. This is an example of what goes up must come down, which is a saying that applies to molecules just as much as it does to larger objects like a ball. The difference is that when molecules come down, they may not be in the same form as they went up. In particular, some chemicals rise into the atmosphere as gases and return to the earth as solutions of acid. These acid solutions can be fog, sleet, snow, or rain. All forms of precipitation can be acidic. How does this happen? It's because when fossil fuels are burned, the gases sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide are produced. The sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide gases go up into the atmosphere where they react with water vapor, which causes a production of sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and these acids fall to earth as acid precipitation. So sulfuric acid is in our guts, where there's a very low pH, very acidic pH to help us break down food. So sulfuric acid and nitric acid are not things that should be prevalent in precipitation at all. And they kill plants and aquatic animals directly or by killing the plants that are the food source, so they indirectly kill them. Here's an example, a visual for the effects of acid precipitation. Dramatic evidence of the direct effects on vegetation can be found in mountain forests like these that are often blanketed by fog. When trees are exposed to acid fog year after year, the leaves are damaged, causing their rate of photosynthesis to decrease, and many of the trees die. The indirect effect of acid precipitation on forests are not as conspicuous, but they are more far-reaching. As acid falls in the soil, it carries away calcium, potassium, magnesium, and sodium ions. The ions are essential nutrients for plants. We'll talk about that in the next chapters. And when they are leached out of the soil, the rate of plant growth is reduced. Some forest animals also feel the impact of the change in soil chemistry. When calcium is depleted, the shells of snails are thinner than usual. As a result of the thinning snail shells, birds that eat snails receive less calcium than normal. And these birds lay eggs with shells so fragile they can crack when the parents are incubating them. So everything is connected. It sounds like some Lion King stuff, but everything is connected. And wiping out one species or a group of producers or a group of primary consumers can have devastating effects on the entire ecosystem in an area. Lastly, lakes and streams are also affected directly and indirectly by acid precipitation, and some lakes in the northeastern United States and northern Europe have pH values as low as 4.0 to 4.3, which is 1,000 times more acidic than pure water. 1,000 times. So look at this graph and answer which state listed below has the most acid precipitation. Pause the video if you need to. The answer is Pennsylvania. So you can see here the northeast has a lot of red and orange. The red is the most acidic pH, meaning it has the most acid in it. And that would be seen here in the heart of the northeast, which includes states like New York and Pennsylvania. Kansas is in the Midwest, along with Texas. They have pretty normal pH. They're not experiencing a lot of acidic rain. Same over here on the west in California. Florida down here does experience some, but not nearly to the extent of Pennsylvania. So acid rain happens because of the burning of fossil fuels that release gases, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide gas, which then becomes sulfuric and nitric acid in the atmosphere. Acid rain is a solvable problem because the deposition of acids from acid rain can be both prevented and cleaned up. Preventative measures include improving energy efficiency, reducing the use of coal, switching to the use of natural gas, increasing the use of renewable energy sources such as wind energy and solar energy. You don't necessarily have to completely get rid of fossil fuels though. We can just make changes to what we're already doing and it would have a big impact in itself. So in the United States, many coal burning plants have now installed special scrubbers to their smokestacks. And what those scrubbers do is they extract hot gases from the power plant and act like sponges that remove sulfur dioxide before it's released into the atmosphere, converting it to a less hazardous form that can be physically removed from the tower and disposed of. A particularly bad thing that causes this would be fracking. Next human activity that can damage the environment is the release of greenhouse gases, which of course influence climate change. Not long ago, debates about global climate change focused on two questions. Number one, is it real? And number two, is it caused by human activities? Many of you will remember the time of Al Gore. Now, the vast majority of scientists today, like 98%, believe that the answer to the first question is yes, it is real, and it is very likely that the answer to the second question is yes, it is caused by human activities. As a consequence, the scientific debate has increasingly moved to questions of, well, what effect will global climate change have on the world as we know it, and more importantly, how can we stop it? The documentary Before the Flood that came out last week has a lot of information on this topic that's current. Some of the evidence that supports the Earth's atmosphere is warming comes from the weather records that extend back to the 1700s. Those records show the average temperature has increased rapidly during the past 50 years, and that 18 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since 1990. Also, data from a report on Antarctic ice cores published in the journal Science in 2007 extend the temperature records back to more than 800,000 years ago. So what they do is they drill down into the ice in Antarctic. That's called an ice core. And they can tell a lot about the temperature records based on that. And that data is published in Science in 2007. Maybe I'll make an extra credit assignment about it. Science is like the leading, most prestigious journal in the science field. So what does greenhouse effect even mean? You've probably heard of it. You may even know what it means, but just make sure we're all on the same page. The term greenhouse effect describes the process by which energy from the sun warms the Earth's atmosphere, kind of like a greenhouse. So the light we see lies in the visible portion of the light spectrum, and visible wavelengths of light pass easily through the atmosphere to warm the Earth's surface. Some energy in the infrared part of the spectrum, which we can't see, flows from Earth back toward space, and several gases in the atmosphere absorb the energy, heating the air. So we talked about this, the solar energy. Only 1% of it gets to plants and get utilized for photosynthesis. Majority of it just doesn't even hit the atmosphere, or it bounces off as heat. So these gases act like the glass panels that make up the roof of a greenhouse. They allow light energy to pass through, but they keep heat from escaping, hence the name greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide and methane, are among the most important of the greenhouse gases. Humans have increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we've done it for primarily one reason. It's because we rely on the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels include coal, oil, gasoline, and natural gas, and we burn them for much of the energy we use. Fossil fuels, which have been stored deep in the earth for millions of years, release carbon dioxide when burned. Clearing land and plowing soil to cultivate crops too releases both carbon dioxide and methane. So we talked about this in I think it's the last chapter, we talked about the carbon cycle. There are reservoirs of carbon. The whole earth is a closed system where we recycle resources over and over. So there's a huge reservoir of carbon in the atmosphere. There's also large reservoirs of carbon deep in the earth as fossil fuels. So if we take the reservoir of fossil fuels, we burn them all up, we're shifting that reservoir of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I bring this up because a lot of times climate deniers will say, well, carbon dioxide isn't bad. We breathe it out all the time. Of course, it's already in the atmosphere. Why is it so bad to have it? Because we're shifting it to have a greater percentage of it in the atmosphere that was never there before, because it was trapped in the fossil fuels, whereas now we burn them and we release it back into the atmosphere where, well, not back, it never was there before. Both environmental and biological evidence reveal the effects of global warming. Shown here on the right, the Arctic Ocean ice cap is melting, and the glaciers that cover Antarctica and Greenland also have been melting at unprecedented rates, and those rates are increasing. So the documentary Before the Flood talks about Greenland in particular. But, I mean, you can see this here. A small child could see this and understand. Since between 1979 and 2012, it's not a lot of years, and that's a lot of melting. Predictions now are the ice caps will be melted in 50 years at this rate, which is crazy. It has consequences not only for sea levels, and also has consequences for continually heating up the earth and like a positive feedback loop, because right now all that ice is there and it's white and it's reflecting sunlight back, but it'll get trapped if it's not there, and it'll keep heating up the earth even more. This doesn't just matter for ice. You can see biological systems are also showing effects of climate change. Trees and flowers in northern latitudes are blooming earlier in the spring than they used to. Migratory birds are arriving at their summer ranges earlier than they did even a decade ago. And birds and butterflies are extending their geographic ranges northward because the earth is warming up. So we don't have to just talk about it. I mean, we can look at animals that don't think about climate change, don't know anything about it. They're running on biological clocks, if you will, to migrate or to have habitat. They're not making conscious decisions. And the data is there that they show up earlier and earlier, and that they're extending their habitat ranges. This has effects for us. Zika virus you've heard about. People are so worried about it in Florida and Texas. As global climate change occurs, and we have a pushing up of hot areas into the southernmost states, we'll see the range of mosquitoes extending into the southernmost states. And mosquitoes are carriers of lots of diseases like Zika, malaria, leishmania, a lot of things you've probably never heard of that exist in South America. So it'll start getting pushed up. Those diseases will start getting pushed up into occurring in the United States more at a higher rate, like in South America, once those South American mosquitoes start living here and have natural habitats here in the States. The changes to the physical environment caused by global warming include thinning of the Arctic Ocean ice, as we just saw, or the flooding of coastal estuaries, and that can have profound effects on biodiversity at the species and ecosystems level. Because adaptation takes a really long time. You have to have those random mutations that build up that through natural selection lead to evolution. And so if climate change happens and such is pushed to these short windows of time, you'll see incredibly large extinction rates. You'll see mass extinctions and declines in biodiversity, much like the asteroid with the dinosaurs. So which of the following is a greenhouse gas? Of the answers shown here, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The other one we talked about that is not here is methane. Methane is released by animals in their farts and poops, basically. But some animals release more methane than others. So cattle release a lot of methane. And so if people could just decrease their consumption of beef, that would be really helpful. Global warming, or we now say climate change, is a difficult issue to tackle because it's so large. It's truly global in scope, necessitating individual efforts, but more so than that, we have to have international cooperation. We just saw the Paris agreements occur. It's a step in the right direction toward international cooperation. It may be too little too late, but it is something. Fundamentally, however, the science is straightforward. Carbon emissions must be reduced significantly. This can be done by individuals who choose to cut down on their own fossil fuel use, to improve the energy efficiency of their homes and cars, and support the development of carbon-free renewable energy sources. Internationally, it can be done through efforts to reduce deforestation while increasing the replanting of forests, and by developing and implementing transportation and industrial innovations that reduce dependence on the fuels that produce greenhouse gases. Innovative technologies such as the underground sequestration of carbon may also contribute to reversing global warming. Lastly, deforestation of rainforests causes loss of species and the release of carbon. Towering trees, colorful birds, and butterflies. Maybe a glimpse of Tarzan swinging past on a hanging vine. That is a popular image of a tropical rainforest. And it is a reasonably accurate picture, minus the Tarzan part, but it's also a picture that is rapidly fading as agriculture, logging, gold mines, oil wells destroy tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests grow in a region extending just a bit north and south of the equator in the continents of South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. As recently as a few centuries ago, that belt of rainforest covered about 6 million square miles. So 25 years ago, it looked like that top graph. And after 25 years of human influence of deforestation, more than half of that forest has already been destroyed, shown here on the bottom. So how does deforestation increase the rate of global warming? I want you to think back to chapter 4 when we talked about photosynthesis. Alright, the answer is number 4, so let's go through them one by one. Number 1, what do plants do? What do trees do? There are types of plants. They take in that carbon dioxide, that CO2 from the atmosphere. They use it in photosynthesis, and a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, okay? And then we breathe in the oxygen, then we breathe out the CO2. So if you take away the forest, you're going to shift that whole dynamic and have less carbon dioxide being removed from the atmosphere. Number 2, as you're burning the trees, that burning process in itself is going to release more of CO2 into the atmosphere. So you're not only not removing it, you're now adding more into it. And then number 3, deforestation changes solar absorption and reflection in area. So you don't have plants doing photosynthesis and absorbing that solar energy. Alright, so obviously, as you saw in that picture, alarming rate of deforestation. This is devastating because tropical rainforests contain more species of plants and animals than all other terrestrial habitats combined. Remember, only less than 1% of our Earth is a biodiversity hotspot. And half of the Earth's biodiversity hotspots are in these forests. Secondly, tropical rainforests remove more than carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than any other terrestrial habitat. As a result, these forests are enormously important in limiting global warming. Deforestation also influences climate change by altering land cover characteristics, meaning the absorption of solar energy. There are some programs that are starting to try and address this deforestation issue, and we're beginning to see some encouraging results, but obviously more work needs to be done here. The biggest issue is we just consume and consume and consume so much. You know, our houses are large, we replace them often, we just use a lot of resources. Instead of preserving the things we have, we are a consumerist society that we just keep buying new things instead of reducing and reusing and recycling as much as we probably could. Here in the United States, we have a lot of natural resources, so we don't feel any pressure to really limit consumption of them. We can just keep using them up, and it doesn't put too much pressure on our lives directly. I think until it does that, we're probably not going to do much about it until we have to, until we wake up and say, oh, we don't have any trees to use anymore. Then we'll get innovative. Unfortunately, I don't know if it'll happen before that. But to try and end on a more positive note, I guess we can develop strategies for effective conservation. Here is a worker carrying a tree to plant at the edge of a desert in China. Trees are planted at the edge of this desert to try and prevent the desert from expanding. Then there's always the question of what should we protect, what should we invest our efforts in. There are so many issues. It's sort of like you have a balloon with a leak and you're trying to stop the leak, but then there's all these other holes popping open, so which ones do you try and stop first? From locale to locale, the particulars of this question of what should we protect may change, but the underlying issue remains. In a world where species are being driven to extinction in a mass extinction faster than we can save them, which should be singled out for preservation, which should we leave to almost certain extinction? This is a question that biologists, policymakers, and ultimately citizens must address. So you got this cute little Egyptian tortoise. Like, oh, we should protect that endangered species. It's adorable. But you also have endangered species of soil bacteria shown below. These microscopic organisms are very important for entire ecosystems, but we don't feel as attracted to them to try and protect them. So it's a convoluted issue. Even if you can get people to and policymakers and citizens to invest funds into that, where do you invest it? The United States, much conservation policy involves response to the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA. This law is designed to protect species from extinction. Species that are dwindling are listed as endangered or threatened according to an assessment of their risk of extinction. And then once a species is listed, legal tools are available to help rebuild the population and protect the habitat critical to its survival. But the Endangered Species Act has had the effect of focusing most conservation efforts on the preservation of individual species. Probably not the best strategies, because sometimes it's at the expense of other elements of biodiversity and at the expense of efforts to reduce the loss of ecologically important habitats. Other difficulties also are associated with the Endangered Species Act. Consider the task of determining the critical population size below which a population is endangered. Is it 500, 5,000, 50,000 individuals? So with its emphasis on preservation of single species, the Endangered Species Act does not effectively address ecosystem decline, which ultimately would help save lots of species, especially in those biodiversity hotspots that include more than 20% of the world's species. But in spite of these difficulties, the species-focused approach to conservation has obviously had some successes in the United States even. It became law in 1973. Since then, approximately 40 species that were listed as endangered, including the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the gray whale, and the grizzly bear, have been taken off the list as their numbers have recovered. Moving on to plants. Without plants, where would you be? They are the base of our terrestrial food webs. They are the producers. They provide both energy and nutrients essential to life. What else do they provide you? Oxygen, building materials, clothing, to name but a few critical roles plants play in our lives. So they're very important, but unfortunately we're not going to cover very many sections of the next 3 chapters to talk about them for the sake of time. But you should be able to know the 3 distinct parts of a plant, the 4 factors necessary for plant growth, how nutrients recycle from soil to plant, know the 4 things found in the soil, and then how plants get their nitrogen from bacteria instead of directly from the atmosphere. Plants are better than animals in some ways. I mean, it's not a contest, but by many measures, though, plants do surpass animals, having developed a stunning diversity of structures and features during their evolution. They can be superior in a variety of ways, such as longevity, or how long they can live, their height, their weight, and their energy acquisition through photosynthesis. Remember, one of the defining features of an animal is we have to eat other things for our food source. Longevity. The longest living plant lives 10 times longer than the longest living animals. Bristlecone pines, found in the western United States, can live for more than 4,800 years. Among animals, the ocean quahog, which is a clam-like mollusk, can live about 200 years. And giant tortoises can live almost 200 years. So the longest living animal species are about 200 years. The longest living plant species are 4,800 years. So they win in longevity. Height. The tallest plants are 20 times taller than the tallest animals. So redwoods, found along the west coast of North America, have grown to more than 379 feet. The tallest giraffe grew to just under 20. Weight. The heaviest plants weigh almost 20 times as much as the heaviest animals. The largest giant sequoias are estimated to weigh more than 3,300 tons. So that's a person in that sequoia down there, you can see. So 3,300 tons. The largest blue whales, believed to be the largest animals ever to inhabit the earth, weigh in at 170 tons. Energy acquisition. Most important is that plants can make their own food, capturing energy from the sun and converting it into usable chemical forms, but animals cannot. So animals rely on primary producers such as plants for their energy. There are 3 distinctive parts of the plants: the roots, the stems, and the leaves. The leaves you should know the leaves are distinctive because they're the primary site of photosynthesis. The stems, you should know that they provide structural support and they conduct food, water, and nutrients throughout the plant. And then the roots absorb water and minerals from the soil and anchor the plant into place. So plants are extremely diverse and they're composed of 3 distinct parts: roots, stems, and leaves. Plants need sunlight, water, and air to thrive, but that's not enough. Without a nutritious diet, plants will get sick, wither, and even die if they don't have adequate nutrition. Plants generally require 4 things for proper nutrition. Those nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, etc. We can see which ones they need and how much they need out of it. So which element or molecule alone is not derived from the soil? Go ahead and pause the video. The answer is number 4, carbon dioxide, because they get that from the atmosphere. So plant growth depends on 4 important factors: sunlight for energy, water, air as a source of carbon dioxide, and then minerals obtained from the soil. Soil is actually made of several different things. Half of it is minerals, which are inorganic elements. Soil gets minerals from the breakdown of weathering rock. And minerals can be broken into 3 different sizes: sand, salt, and clay. The other almost half of soil is 2 components, water and air, which fills the space between the particles of minerals and organic material. And then the organic material is less than 5% of soil, which organic material, remember, contains carbon, and that's formed from the decomposition of dead plants and animals. So soil is a mixture of minerals, organic matter, air, and water. And it's the source of nutrients that are critical to a plant's health and survival. The best soils have about equal amounts of each type of particle. The minerals present in soil determine the pH of the soil and can affect how well plants grow and even influence the color of flowers, in this example shown here with hydrangeas. You've probably seen different colored hydrangeas. That's how gardeners can force the color change, by changing the pH of the soil artificially. Although all hydrangeas are colored by the same pigment, when the soil is acidic, meaning a pH of like 5 to 5.5, that means there's more of the mineral aluminum available to the plant, causing the flower to bloom in blue. But when the soil is less acidic, pH of like 6.5, they bloom pink. And we've already talked about what some of the minerals are that it needs. Organic materials, so leaves fall and animals die, but decomposition returns their chemicals to the soil. An important decomposer is the fungus. Also several different types of bacteria. And decomposition makes returns those chemicals to the soil, making reuptake by plant roots possible. Animal droppings are another important thing to plants. So sometimes fertilizer smells like poop, and that's because there's probably actually poop in it, because it's a source of organic material for plants. Animal droppings have concentrated bits of nitrogen. Perhaps the most important of the essential plant nutrients is nitrogen, called humus. Organic decay products make up about 1 to 5% of the soil. What is composting? You've probably heard of composting. You may not know a lot about it. Compost heaps can speed the process of organic breakdown, which is usually really slow, and it can greatly reduce the volume of waste that cities process and dispose of, while generating a product that can be distributed to help return plant nutrients to the soil. So I made my own little composting bucket. Ideally you have a heap, which is much larger, but everyone can compost in a bucket because it fits on your tiny back porch. In my case, I don't have a yard. So what you do is you add different bacteria to it that you just buy in a bag from the hardware store, from like Home Depot. And then you just throw in wastes from your kitchen, or yard clippings, eggshells, coffee grounds, the ends of carrots that you don't want to eat when you're chopping them up for dinner. And then in that container, since there's a higher concentration of bacteria there than in these huge dumps where you normally have all your trash for the whole city, you're going to have it break down those organic wastes, those decomposing bacteria, and then you get a really nice fertilizer for your garden. I don't have a garden because I don't have a yard. I give it to my local community garden and they use it. Water and air, the final components of soil, they're pretty straightforward. Composting produces which components of a soil? Go ahead and pause. The answer is humus, number 2. That's the organic stuff that's broken down by decomposers. Alright, so again, soil is a mixture of these 4 things. Nitrogen is a really essential nutrient for plants, and they can only get the nitrogen they need with the help of bacteria. The problem is that nitrogen in the atmosphere is abundant, but it exists as a molecule of two nitrogen atoms. We call it dinitrogen, which are bound very tightly and stably together. That nitrogen in the atmosphere is not usable for plants or animals. It has to be converted to a molecule with a single nitrogen atom, like ammonia or nitrate. And the only things that can break apart those strong, stable bonds of the two nitrogen atoms in the atmosphere nitrogen molecule are bacteria that have evolved to do so. You think of bacteria as metabolic wizards. Several species of them can break down those two nitrogen molecules, and they can break them apart using an enzyme they produce called nitrogenase. And that gets the nitrogen into a plant usable form through a process called nitrogen fixation. So what you need to know is bacteria, through nitrogen fixation, take unusable atmospheric bacteria and fix it into a usable form for plants. This is a mutually beneficial relationship that has evolved that enables plants to get access to the nitrogen fixed by these bacteria. Again, this process is nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen is the mineral that most commonly limits plant growth because it is required by nearly all cells, and nitrogen does not exist in a usable form in nature. But plants are in luck because several species of bacteria can do a process called nitrogen fixation. Okay, next chapter, 18, growth and reproduction in plants. We'll go over sections 1, 4, 7, and 9, so you should know how do plants reproduce, what role do flowers play in plant reproduction, and how do pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal depend on help from other organisms. So plants can reproduce either sexually or asexually. Reproduction without a partner would be asexual reproduction, sort of like cloning. Most of the trees or shrubs we see in gardens are the result of asexual reproduction. So too are nearly all household plants purchased from nurseries, which makes sense if you think about it. They're stuck inside. There's not a lot of other plants around. New individual plants are grown directly from the tissues of established plants through mitosis. So mitosis, if you remember back, is when you have an exact replica of a cell. There is no genetic diversity in mitosis. There's no meiosis used to produce gametes or sex cells. And there's no fertilization of one gamete by another. One example would be raspberry plants. You can propagate raspberry plants by cutting sprouts from their roots and just replanting them, and bam, you get a new plant. And potato plants can be generated from their underground storage stems. Plants can reproduce sexually even though they can't move, so you don't have to be able to move to have sex if you're a plant. For all of its efficiency and advantages, asexual reproduction just doesn't measure up to sexual reproduction in plants because, again, remember, sexual reproduction is so important for genetic diversity. Despite the difficulties associated with being anchored in one place, the ability of plants to reproduce sexually is at the heart of their evolutionary success. Because sexually reproducing populations generate large amounts of genetic diversity, they can keep up with changing conditions better than asexually reproducing plants by adapting to new environments. Although flowers are the same fundamental structure, they appear in many forms. They have exotic shapes, varied textures, different sizes, and they come in about every color imaginable. And that's because they're the chief structure for sexual reproduction. So plants have evolved a variety of flower shapes and smells and colors. And they've done that so that they can have pollination happen. This is a pie chart showing you the approximate proportion of flowering plants species pollinated. Alright, so some plants are pollinated by non-animals, by the wind or the water. But the majority of plants that undergo sexual reproduction and have flowers are pollinated by animals. The biggest pollinator being bees in this huge section of the pie right here. So which animal pollinator pollinates the largest number of flowering plant species? Go ahead and pause the video. The answer is number 3, bees. Because plants can't walk around and find a sexual partner, they need help getting the male gamete to the female gamete for fertilization. With the transition to land during evolution, seed plants had to reduce their reproductive dependence on water, and a number of ways evolved that bring together male and female gametes. Often this process involves enlisting animals to carry the male gametes to the female gametes. No matter the method though, a pollen grain from a plant must journey, so the pollen grain is the male gamete, it must journey to the stigma of another plant of the same species. That process is called pollination. About 10% of plant species achieve pollination by simply releasing their pollen into the wind, but in the vast majority, 90% of plants, animals are used as the go-betweens, moving pollen from one plant to another. Plants attract animals as their pollinators with the flower through visual cues, olfactory cues, and tactile cues. That's why there's such a wide variety of flower types. 2 different and clever strategies for achieving pollination are bribery and trickery. Bribery is when plants bribe some animals to carry their pollen from one individual to another. Trickery is when they deceive animals into doing the job. So an example of bribery would be a hummingbird getting some nectar, but while it's getting the nectar, some pollen's going to brush off onto it that it'll then carry over to another plant. So which type of relationship exists between plants and animal pollinators? Pause the video. The answer is number 3. So this is using a question testing what you learned from the last lecture we had. So commensalism, actually, the answer would be mutualism. I apologize. So mutualism would be when both parties mutually benefit. So the animals are benefiting by getting food, and the plants are benefiting by getting pollinators to carry the pollen to the female gametes. Sometimes it could be commensalism if the animal is not benefiting from the situation as much as the plant is, which is possible, especially in the case of trickery. But usually it's bribery, so usually plants and animal pollinators have a mutualism relationship. There have been strong coevolutions between plants and their animal pollinators. After pollination occurs, fertilization is going to happen. So pollination brings the male and female gametes close to each other so that fertilization happens. Fertilization requires the male and female gametes to fuse so that their genetic material can be combined. So much like a sperm and an egg in human species comes together and fuses to combine genetic material, and then meiosis happens. Meiosis results in the gametes, and then they fuse, and then mitosis happens. But fertilization is required in plants just like it is in humans. I just like telling people this because people don't know this, and I think it's kind of weird. So when you eat an apple or any fruit, you're consuming the ovary of the flower. So a seed is the fertilization of male and female gametes, then grows into a seed. And then around that seed, to protect it, the ovary wall develops into a fruit. That fruit will then get eaten, and then the seed could be excreted by birds and other animals into the soil so that seed can grow into a full plant. So by encasing seeds in a juicy, nutritious structure, aka the fruit, plants create a package that entice hungry animals to then take that developing plant fetus, if you will, called the seed, and take it to a new location. The last chapter deals with defending how plants defend and regulate themselves while rooted in the ground. They can't walk around to defend themselves or run like we do. Just 2 sections. 1, how do plants defend themselves from herbivores that want to eat them, and then how do plants survive extreme environments. That's all we'll talk about. Plants are under almost constant attack, from microbes to fungus, animals, even other plants. Organisms make varied and persistent efforts to access the valuable resources in plants. Plants have evolved to fight back. They actively resist being eaten through numerous defenses. Those defenses can be categorized in these 4 major groups: mechanical, chemical, mimicry, and camouflage, and then enlisting other animals for security. Several types of plants' defenses involve physical structure or movements. Thorns, spines, and hairs can be enough of a deterrent to many herbivores, in some cases harming or even killing them, to significantly reduce predation. Waxes and sap produce leaves covered with waxy components to reduce predation. And then you could even have defensive movements. So many plants, particularly those in the mimosa family, use a movement mechanism to rapidly flatten their leaves in response to touch. I saw these on my honeymoon in Costa Rica. So you touch them, it's crazy. You touch them and all the leaves immediately flatten down. This quickly decreases the surface area available for pests to chew on the leaves. So these are all mechanical defense examples. One of the most common methods that plants use to fight herbivores is the production of chemical defenses. These chemical compounds deter herbivores by making the plant toxic, so that's not digestible, so then they don't even want to mess with it eating it. Some animals have co-evolved to be able to eat certain plants, though. This example here is the monarch butterfly caterpillars can consume poisonous plant chemicals when they feed on milkweed that usually other animals cannot tolerate. Humans have long made use of some of these quote-unquote defensive compounds produced by plants in their chemical defense. Example is spices. So spicy foods such as mustard usually get their flavor from plant compounds that may make the plant toxic or unpalatable to an insect but are not toxic to humans. Also medicines. Many of our medicines come from chemical compounds developed by plants as a defense. There has been a large increase in the number of researchers looking for plant compounds with potential medicinal uses. So, there you go. This is an example of mimicry as a defense. So the 3rd category, these passion flower leaves are covered with what appears to be butterfly eggs. You've probably seen these leaves before, actually. The leaf spots are actually produced by the plant themselves, and the mimicry of looking like they have butterfly eggs discourages a butterfly from selecting that site for egg laying. So plants don't want butterflies to lay their eggs on them because then caterpillars come out and eat their leaves. So they put these little bumps on there to tell the butterflies, hey, already occupied. Go put your eggs somewhere else. The last group is enlisting other organisms for security. Acai plants, spelled ACACIA. It's a common flavor in drinks right now. Acai plants produce a sweet nectar that attract ants. Those ants then hollow out thorns in the plants and live inside of them. In exchange for the ants' room and board, they quickly and aggressively attack leaf-eating insects, effectively reducing the predator's ability to feed on the plant. The ants are typically trim back competing plants from their acais, dramatically reducing competition for water and light for the host plant. So go ahead and answer this question. The effects of poison ivy on herbivores and humans is an example of, pause the video. Number 2, chemical defense. So being rooted in the ground makes plants easy targets, but they actively resist by producing toxic chemicals or through mechanical means, mimicry, and using guards. Special adaptations help some plants thrive in extreme environments. We'll talk about some examples of adaptations to super dry, to salty, and to cold, windy habitats. Alright, example of super dry habitats. In deserts, groundwater is scarce, and moisture loss due to evaporation and the hot temperature can further constrain a plant's ability to retain water. Plants have responded to this difficult condition with several types of adaptations. One is succulent leaves and stems. The evolution of thick, fleshy, water-storing tissues in the leaves and stems of cactus and other succulents reduces the surface area to volume ratio of their photosynthetic parts, which helps minimize water loss due to evaporation through leaves. Another one is deep taproots. Taproot is like a really long, thick root that goes deep into the ground. Plants such as mesquite establish strong and deep taproots, often boring into the soil a dozen meters or more to find sources of water far beneath the surface. Also, long dormant seeds. So many dry adapted plants have seeds that can remain dormant for long periods of time. They wait out the dry times and then quickly grow in response to brief periods of moisture. Salty environments. Survival in salt include mangroves here. They're able to transport much of the salt absorbed through their roots and excrete it through their leaves. So the salt sits on the leaf surface until it dries up and blows away. And then cold, windy habitat. Plants living in these habitats tend to grow close to the ground, and they have smaller than average leaves and shallow root systems. Which makes sense. If it's windy, you don't have a bunch of leaves and branches poking high up into the air with leaves flying off everywhere. Pine trees are evergreen with wax-covered needles instead of leaves, so they don't have leaves. To which environment are they best adapted? Pause the video. The answer is number 3. So no, they are not low to the ground, but they have the adaptation of not having leaves to blow away, so they don't have to grow low to the ground. They can grow high up into the windy air because they have needles. So plants have become adapted to some of the most extreme world's habitats, including super dry regions, salty environments, and cold, windy habitats. And that is the end of this lecture.